So good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to Real Estate Live UK. Now, as many of you will know, Real Estate Live is a week-long programme of events that is taking place via Zoom all this week. And Real Estate Live takes place 3 times a year in February, June and October. And now all of these events are free to attend. And that's thanks to the support of our partners. And all of these events are brought to you by White Label. And I'd like to give a big thank you to all of the organisations that have contributed to the fantastic lineup that we have taking place this week. Now, during the 1-hour sessions, places across the UK are showcasing investment opportunities, and industry-leading experts from the public and private sectors will be discussing new ideas and topical issues relating to property. And you can view the full programme that's taking place all across the week at the website realestatelive.co.uk. Now, really importantly, this morning's session that is about to begin is our London Keynote, and a very, very important subject that we're all going to be discussing. What are London's plans to reach net zero as we approach COP26? Now, before we begin the panel, just to remind you all, I'm sure you're all really familiar with this by now, but you can ask questions, and we'd really like to make this as interactive as possible. Put some challenging questions to our panelists, and let's have a really good discussion this morning, which really will have some meaning and some depth. So just remember to use that Q&A function. And now I'm really pleased to better hand over to our chair for this conversation. Hi, Amy Till, Programme Director of the NLA. Over to you, Amy.
Thank you, Catherine. Good morning, everyone. Catherine's made my housekeeping life a lot easier by giving you a rundown on how the session's going to work. So I can just dive straight in and introduce our fantastic speakers this morning, who have a lot of knowledge to share and are really in the know on this topic as we discuss where we're at on the way to COP26 in November and London reaching those net zero targets. So I'd like to introduce Shirley Rodrigues, Deputy Mayor for Environment and Energy at the GLA. Hello, Shirley.
Hi.
Simon Sturgis from Targeting Zero. Hi, Simon. And Andrew Dakers, Chief Executive from West London Business. Thank you for joining us this morning. Hello. So I'll be asking each of our speakers to share some opening remarks on this topic, and then we'll go into a discussion. As Catherine said, do pop your questions in the Q&A if they come up as we go through. So Shirley, I'd like to come to you first. The spotlight's on the UK at the moment. COP26 is in November. What plans have the GLA got between now and then, and where are we at on our journey?
Thanks, Amy, and thanks for inviting me to talk about London's net zero plans. And as you mentioned, the next few weeks are absolutely going to be really critical for the world, for London, for us all. We've got COP26, but more parochially in London, we have the expansion of the ultra-low emission zone going live on the 25th of October, which, whilst it's tackling air pollution, also helps tackle climate change. And we all know, we've seen the various news reports every day about how important this issue is. The recent IPCC findings given us even more cause for concern, showing that we're really off track, and that if we don't really sort of buckle down, we're looking at temperature rises of 2.7 degrees centigrade by the end of the century, not the 1.5 that we really need to stop runaway climate change. And that's why the Mayor really believes that we have to take action now. The next 10 years is absolutely critical for climate action. And that's why he's accelerated his target for a net zero carbon city, originally 2050, but now to 2030. He was one of the first mayors of a mega city to produce a climate action plan that was compatible with the Paris Agreement. And we're now just reviewing that modelling to take account of that accelerated target. And what we're trying to do is been putting that into implementation, not because of COP26, but because, it's the right thing to do. And obviously the pandemic has sort of rocked us all very hard and has brought economic and social impacts. And as we look to recover from the pandemic, we're also taking the opportunity to tackle the climate and ecological emergencies and really address the sort of inequalities that COVID-19 really highlighted. And those people who are most vulnerable to COVID-19 are also the ones that are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And we know that if we take action on climate, we can also help boost London's economy, and grow those sort of economic activity and green new jobs that we need. In London, for example, our green economy sector is huge. Actually, it's bigger than the manufacturing and construction sectors combined, and we want to see that double. It's already grown in size, doubled in size over the last 10 years. And the Mayor has come together with London boroughs and various other stakeholders across London in a recovery board, agreed a Green New Deal mission, which is really focusing on doubling that green economy by 2030 to around 100 billion. We're going to do that by tackling climate change, tackling the other environmental challenges that we face as well, from air pollution through to our sort of biodiversity issues. So what are we doing? We are making some progress in London. I can't sort of run through everything that the Mayor is doing, but some of the areas are, we're going to touch on this a bit later, I guess, and particularly of interest to people on the call, I think, are starting with our built environment. So the London Plan has put in place a new requirement for new homes and mixed-use development to be net zero. And that's really been helping developers to be as close to net zero emissions as possible on site, and where they can't, then to pay an offset payment into local authorities to help them implement carbon saving initiatives. And that plan is already delivering. We have seen, we just published a report, an annual monitoring report, showing that we're achieving 46% greater carbon savings than if we just met building regulations as they are now. So that's a big difference. But obviously our building sector, we have a huge built environment in London that already exists that needs to be retrofitted. We've got what Sadiq calls a retrofit revolution, about how we're really going to hit the deep retrofit to hit carbon targets. It's not just the sort of retrofit that people have been used to in the past with just a bit of insulation and a bit of our windows and roofs. It really is a sort of systemic change. We've been piloting a lot of programs to really understand what that means in London through various accelerator programs, for example. We've recently secured more government funding, about 160 million, to take this forward. He's established an innovation partnership where we're bringing together social housing providers and UK building firms to really perform whole house deep retrofits in social housing. And that has the potential of supporting £10 billion of retrofit works across England, not just London, and supporting growth in jobs over the next decade in the order of about 150,000 jobs. But that isn't going to be enough to meet the climate targets we need. So we're going to be hosting a retrofit summit with London councils and the Recovery Board members next spring to really set out commitments that we're all going to be taking to ramp up and accelerate our action on retrofitting, and not just on our homes, but on our workplaces, and not just on finance, but also how do we build the skills and the supply chain that we need. I could go on. Lots of stuff we can touch on renewables. We've been helping homeowners with a group purchasing scheme to put solar PV on their roofs. We're going to be powering the tube with 100% green energy. We're going to be starting a power purchase agreement process over the next few months. We've been working really hard on reducing emissions from transport. I mentioned the ultra low emission zone already. That's helped reduce carbon emissions from transport, road transport, by 6% just in that central London congestion charging zone area. From the 25th of October, that zone expands out to the north and south circulars. So that's the whole of inner London, 18 times the current size. So we're looking to see that help reduce air pollution across the city, not just in that inner London area, but also reduce carbon emissions. Sadiq's just announced that we're only going to be buying new zero emission buses. And that's meant that we can, guarantee that we'll have a zero emission bus fleet by 2034. And with government funding, extra funding, we could bring that forward to 2030. All of this, of course, costs money. We've estimated about 60 billion. That was under our old 2050 target. It's probably a lot more. So we're working to develop a new financing facility for London alongside the work that the government is doing and others as well. So just thinking about COP ahead, it's really important at a national level that we have the really high ambition from every country to rapidly reduce emissions and meet science-based targets. We need a financial package, the one that's been still being argued about, being actually delivered in order to help those cities, countries that are least developed. But most of all, we need our own government to lead by example. And, we've been waiting a long time for a series of strategies and announcements. And, we're hoping to see those come out before COP that will really provide that long-term certainty for all of us, for policymakers, for financiers, for the supply chain, so whether it's the net zero strategy or the buildings and heat decarbonisation strategy, we're looking forward to the comprehensive spending review to really enable us to provide the funding that will help us to accelerate action in London. So I'll stop there. I think I've talked a little bit about, a lot of the work that we're doing. There's loads more that we can talk about, but I think I just want to make the point that, this is a really keynote moment for us all to step up. But it isn't the end point. It really is the beginning, I think. We have to reduce our emissions for every sector, and every sector has to play its part. Whether it's local authorities or businesses or individuals, in fact. Without that concerted action, we're not going to hit that 1.5 degree guardrail that we need to keep within. So thank you, and really happy and looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks very much, Shirley. It's really great to just set the scene and get that overview for what the priorities are for the GLA and what you're hoping to see in advance of COP26 in November. And your last point there segued very nicely into the question that I have for Simon, which is around what the public and the private sector need to do to support this ambition to get to net zero. So, Simon, I'll hand over to you now.
Brilliant. So, the government targets, and Shirley's alluded to this, is net zero by 2050, and the government target is 78% by 2035. But as Shirley said, that the net zero ambition for London is obviously to achieve that by 2030. Next slide, please. So you might want to take screen grabs of these next two slides because they contain a lot of the basic information that you'd need in order to achieve carbon assessments for the built environment. So at the top there, I've got the basic international standards, which set up the sort of overarching framework. And then below that, we've got the British standards. And the British standards on the left there are to do with buildings, the environmental performance of buildings, to do with whole life carbon assessment, and therefore you need to be able to do that in order to achieve know what you're doing to achieve zero carbon. The one to the right of that, 15804 there, is about environmental product declarations. So if every time so increasingly products that you buy for construction will have what's called an EPD, or environmental product declaration. And that is to determine the carbon footprint of that particular product. And then on the right there, there's a standard that's going to be coming out soon, which is to do with the sustainability of construction works, of civil engineering work. So whereas the two on the left are to do really with buildings, although the products obviously apply to both, the one on the right is to do with the infrastructure, the stuff in between, the roads, the drainage, and so on. And then below that, you've got the RICS professional statement, which I co-authored, and that sets up the methodology for doing carbon assessments in the UK. And another thing I'm running at the moment, which we're hoping to get government funding for, is to upgrade that. This was published in 2017. Next slide, please. So this is showing a kind of a spread of the guidances and things that are some of the guidances, well, most of the key ones that are out there. On the left there, you've got two from the RIBA, the Embodied and Whole Life Carbon Assessment, which I also wrote. And then you've got the RIBA Climate 2030 Climate Challenge, which many people are using as a sort of benchmarking. And interestingly enough, that benchmarking is now used not just in London, but also used across the UK. You then got CIBSE, which is the mechanical engineers, and that again gives you, that document TM65 gives you the information on how to calculate carbon cost of equipment, plant, air conditioning, and so on. Then you've got structural engineers, then the Whole Life Carbon Network, which gives you a range of definitions, and you can access that through the LETI website, LETI, which I'll come to in a second. But if you go to publications, you can access that. Then you've got the UK Green Building Council and the World Green Building Council, which have both produced guidance. The one you can see there, the net zero carbon buildings, came out 2 years ago, and that is a really useful overarching guidance. And then some of you will have come across the LETI Climate Emergency Design Guide and the embodied carbon primer. And you will now find that those two, that plus the RIBA 2030 climate challenge, and below that you can see GLA London policies, policy SI2, all of those synchronized now with the targets or rather the benchmarking that we should be achieving year on year as we go through to 2050. And then we've got the the construction playbook, which makes reference to whole life carbon as part of what's going on. And then below that, I've already mentioned the GLA London Plan policies. So there's SI2 on whole life carbon, which is mandatory you're required to do assessments for referable schemes to the mayor. And on the right there, you've got the circular economy statement. And both of those have just currently going through the final adjustments. They've been out for public consultation, but they're going through final adjustments, and they will be made available in November of this year. And those will synchronize with each other. And then on the left there, you've got the sort of information data, because of course you can't do this without data and so on. So you've got there the top data sheets, environmental product declarations I mentioned before, and you've got databases. I've listed a few there, which where you can get this information from. The Bath ICE database is free, and down at the bottom there in purple, I've got RICS buildings and products. The RICS is starting on a project to record the carbon footprint of buildings and also products. So that will be free access, if you're an RICS member. And then there's software just above that in green. There are various software, some of which are free. So HBERT and FCS, Field and Collect Bradley Studios Carbon, are both downloadable from the internet and are fairly simple. The other ones, eTool, OneClick, and Ecolab, you have to pay for and are of different levels of complexity. Next slide, please. So what this is trying to show you is getting to net zero, if you like. So on the left there, I've got a sort of breakdown of a typical building. In fact, it comes from an office building, but it applies to a residential in different proportions to an extent. But what you're looking at there is the primary structure, services, cladding, interior, and energy use. So that's what the carbon footprint over 60 years might look like. And what I'm saying here, where that arrow is, that green box, 20 to 30%, I'm saying that today, right now, in 2021, it is possible to achieve those sorts of reductions in the overall carbon footprint looking forward of that sort of order just by choosing better. We have the technology, the supply chain will sell you those items. So there's nothing intrinsically difficult about getting 20 to 30% reductions of what we already do. And then, as you can see there, as again Shirley alluded to, whatever you haven't achieved through that, you have a residual offset to achieve net zero, which today might be quite large. Next slide, please. So this is showing sort of progressive steps. So in order to get through to 2035 or 2030 in London to net zero, there are progressively more and more things you would need to do. And it is worth thinking that some of those are still actually cost neutral. And certainly, as I said, the first 20 to 30%, you can achieve those cost neutrally. So this is not about necessarily spending huge sums of money. This is about making better choices. And it is fair to say that getting to 2030, I think, is relatively easy for getting significant reductions. But getting past that, we have to be a bit more innovative. We have to think about our buildings a bit more carefully and go a bit further. But the tools are there, and we just have to use it. And I think all of this applies whether it's a capital project for local authorities, your own capital projects, or it's for planning regulation. And the GLA London Plan, which I mentioned a bit earlier, has in that the whole life carbon policy SI2 sets out the kind of things you should be thinking about for a planning submission, but also for your own capital investment projects. I think that's the last slide. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. Very good reading list you've just flashed up on screen there for us. Andrew, I'd like to come to you next as a voice for business leaders in West London. Simon's just shared a whole spectrum of different resources and guidance with us. Do businesses have what they need? And if not, what extra support do they need?
Thank you, Amy. And yes, I too was taking notes there at the end as Simon puts his slide up. I'm going to reflect, I suppose, in two areas to try to do my best to answer your question. The first is around this question of support, what's out there and what's needed, and then the second is around infrastructure, because I'm going to argue that businesses can go so far, but then cooperation and collaboration across sectors becomes absolutely critical. I think that in the support space, I'm going to crudely argue that if you're a large business, and I'm sure we've got many large businesses in the construction industry tuned in today, you're going to be relatively well set up by now. We certainly should be, because we've been discussing this for a good 15 or 20 years, I'd suggest. And on our travels at West London Business, we work closely with the sustainability directors and managers that are now based in large construction firms and driving this agenda forward. And of course, we've heard from Simon, how the professional institutes have come around the sort of transition ahead, so that the guidance really is out there and already being tapped into by larger firms. I think where we've got a far greater challenge is with the SMEs across our capital, that of course for the construction sector make up the tiers 2 and tier 3 of the supply chain. And there, we certainly haven't been sitting on our hands at West London Business. We've been working over the past 6 years with City Hall, with Sustainable Ventures, with Imperial College London in a very deep and practically oriented partnership called Better Futures, which has supported clean tech innovators bringing new products and services to both the London market, but in fact also the national and global market, to accelerate the development of their ideas. And if you go to the betterfutures.london website today, you can browse a directory of all those businesses. And in fact, if you're looking for new ideas, new suppliers, you can get on the phone to them right away. So we've been working with the innovators, providing them with the practical support. But what we've recognised over the past 2 years is that, of course, we still have, well, in fact, over 1 million SMEs across London that you might describe as perhaps more mainstream and needing really practical advice and hand-holding to transition to net zero, and hopefully to commit to transitioning to net zero by 2030. So in the first half of this year, with our partners, we launched Better Futures Plus, which is focused on supporting those mainstream enterprises make the transition. We ran a pilot through the first 6 months of this year, and we hope sort of on the 25th of October, that's current date we've got in mind, that will go live on the next phase of Better Futures Plus, which will see us scale up over the next 12 months to supporting almost 600 businesses across the capital. And it's very practical advice and sort of tools that we're providing. Every business that participates gets access to the Climate Essentials tool, which is a carbon auditing tool to assess your baseline and then start to plot out what your sort of transition pathway looks like to net zero. There are 8 webinars, again, free to access for participants, that make up a zero carbon business leadership program, deep diving into everything from what to do about scope 1 and 2, as well as your scope 3 supply chain emissions. And then wrapped around that are peer learning groups. So you're not just being taught at, but you can then spend time with fellow business leaders comparing notes on the plans that you're starting to put in place. So I think hopefully some good news there, that there is support coming through, initially focused at almost 600 businesses, but frankly, over the next few years, we're going to have to be scaling to thousands or tens of thousands of businesses with that hand-holding. So the support is there, I'd argue, for those that want to take it. And if that has piqued your interest, either of your own business or your supply chain, do drop me an email after this panel. But the other bit of the jigsaw, of course, is infrastructure. And what we've found through the pilot program and starting to map out those transition plans with London's SMEs is that you can go so far with what's within your own control, but there comes a point where the wider infrastructure needs to fall in place. The 2 areas that I think really for us are front and fore of mind. One is energy. Of course, you've got the option to switch your energy supply from brown to a green supplier, but that's only one part of the solution. We'd argue if you can generate your own energy on site, then that should be part of the mix. That's not necessarily very easy to do if you're an SME that doesn't have the expertise in that area. So I think some really exciting work currently underway in Park Royal, which tell folks more about if anyone's interested. But at scale, there is an opportunity for really substantial heat networks to be put in place across the UK's largest industrial estate, and also, of course, huge amounts of roof space in Park Royal for solar to be installed at scale, and those two projects really moving forward at quite a pace now. But from the lessons learned in Park Royal, we've clearly got to then take that right the way across the capital. And then on transport and mobility, we of course live in a fantastically connected city with brilliant bus and sort of rail infrastructure. We don't always have railways, unfortunately, in the right places. And of course, I'm kept up at night in West London by the lack of orbital rail connectivity. So, more work for us to do there. And as we see the city, thank goodness, coming back to life after this pandemic, some of our roads have started to get pretty congested again. So it's not just how we move people around the city, but also goods. And there I'd spotlight one of our innovators as I bring my remarks to a close, and that is Magway, who are a startup based in northwest London with their test rig in Wembley. They've been sort of piloting over the past few years how gas mains sort of size tubes can effectively be used to sort of shoot small boxes of goods through gas mains. Is the best way of visualizing it, I think, to different destinations and different nodes on a network that they want to build out under our city. So if we can make some radical transitions and transformations like that to get at least some of the white vans off our roads onto sort of net zero sort of in infrastructure, then some of these big leaps and step changes that are clearly critical over the next few years will become possible.
Thank you, Andrew. Great to hear about some of the tools and resources that you're putting out there for the organisations that you work with, and a lot of examples in there and references that support what Shirley was saying earlier around the ambition to double the green economy sector in the next few years. So, Shirley, I just wondered if there was anything you wanted to come back to on Andrew's points there around potential limitations around infrastructure supporting businesses in the city to reach these targets.
Yeah, so just a couple of points. So absolutely, infrastructure is critical to help London, and we've been doing quite a lot of work, I think, helping to map the scale of interventions we need, whether it's where is the solar potential in London, what's the state of our building stock, so that we understand in terms of retrofitting where we might need to focus our efforts, providing that information so that, it's not just public sector organisations, but private sector organisations that can use it to create new businesses and so on. We've been working very hard, for example, on electric vehicle infrastructure. Over the last few years, since Sadiq was elected, we've now got a network of over 300 rapid chargers across London. Thousands more standard chargers. So we represent about 30% of the UK's charging network just in London, and that's not by accident. That's because of design. We work very hard with policies to secure government funding and with the private sector to make sure that the infrastructure was there to support the policies the mayor was bringing in. For example, only allowing zero emission capable taxis to operate in London, and no longer licensing diesel taxis, but also the policies that we've been working on air pollution and climate to really encourage people to move away from polluting vehicles into cleaner vehicles, electric vehicles primarily. And we'll be updating that strategy shortly, to keep pace with the rapid rise in electric vehicles that we're seeing. Really important. But the problem for us, obviously, it all needs to be financed. And I mentioned that earlier. In minimum 60 billion, probably hundreds of billions more if you think about retrofitting our homes, putting the sort of infrastructure we need, like heat networks and so on. And that financing facility is one way of trying to encourage that sort of private sector investment. We can't do this through public investment alone. But we also need to work together to tackle the challenges that the private sector have in mobilising finance around the sort of agglomeration of capital projects, developing a pipeline and a steady pipeline that they can rely on, and a revenue stream for them. So these are all really complicated, complex issues that we're working on with, for example, partners in the Corporation of London and with local authorities. I touched on the supply chain. One of the big issues for us is skills. So as we try and retrofit our buildings, everybody else around the country is also doing the same thing. We have very limited supply, and not necessarily people who are skilled in these jobs. And I think the problem with sort of the turning on and off the taps of government finance has been that just as companies start mobilizing and training staff, then the funding goes off and then they stop. And that's really what we need from government now, is certainty, long-term certainty of funding, so that we are able then to help work with colleagues like Andrew's and others to really help build that supply chain for London, and beyond. And one of the other issues, I think, is about powers. So the emissions that we have in London, the mayor only has control over about half of them. So we really rely on government to either take action or devolve the powers to us and other cities and other local authorities who are keen to take action. And I've talked a little bit about what we're doing, but many other local authorities in London and beyond are really going hard for to tackle the climate emergency. So I think that devolution of powers would be really helpful. And just in closing, just say, the Better Futures programme is one example of what the mayor is doing to support that sort of economic development in London. So that programme is funded through the Green New Deal funding. We've just injected, I think, $1 million into that, and that's partly really to focus in West London, which has been really hard hit by the economic impacts of COVID. So this is an opportunity to help build greener. So that's one of the ideas that we want to encourage across London.
Lost Amy.
Yes, well,
hopefully not for. Hopefully not for long.
I think that was probably exactly. But I think that Better Futures is absolutely, if people are talking about how do we help SMEs, that's a big issue for London. We don't have big industrial sort of activities here, so we have to support SMEs. And for people on today's event, we have a London Business Hub that has information. There's a climate section in there, and we'll be launching something ahead of COP as well. So do keep an eye out for that. But I think one of the things we do is work very closely with colleagues like Andrew at West London Business to really hone in on where we might support businesses and growth across London.
Two points I'd like to briefly pick up on that there. One is the challenges of energy. I mean, I think that the sheer scale of the switch, frankly, is quite mind-boggling. If all of our heating and all of our mobility moves towards electricity, different reports come to different conclusions as to just what scale of ramp up that means. But 2.5 times our current consumption of electricity doesn't seem unrealistic. And of course, we have an aging grid across the city. In Park Royal, so occasionally, unfortunately, we've had parts of the grid melt down, which then requires very rapid intervention to make sure that manufacturing can sort of restart. So as you say, the investment to grow the energy infrastructure, distribution infrastructure at local level is vast. You talked about skills, Shirley, but one of my frustrations sometimes in this discussion is that I think we sort of perhaps try and put green skills in a box.
Yes.
A West London business, our view is that every job's got to be a green job moving forward. It doesn't matter what your role is. There's going to be climate change related changes to the content of what you've got to do, whether you're an internal auditor, a company director, or someone that's in the thick of a construction site, delivering some of this on the ground, and that of course puts real stress on the skills system, and is really, I think, perhaps for our FE colleges and independent training providers, is going to make for a demanding few years ahead to really kind of gear up to meet the supply chain needs that you touched upon.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Shirley. We have got a few questions coming in from the audience. Although Simon Well, I was hoping to turn to you to talk a bit more about the London plan, because we have some policy questions coming in. But was there something you wanted to add on the skills discussion?
Yes, I think the skills self-evidently need to be in people who install things, but also amongst professionals. There is the stuff I've just shown on my slides is available. It's out there for professionals, but it's surprising how few are aware of it and are beginning, how few are also beginning to put their toe in the water in terms of learning about what they need to do, whether they're architects, engineers, or whatever, or client bodies to deal with the low carbon position. And my sort of mantra is that just remember what happened to Kodak. Kodak was, a huge company that made film for cameras all over the world, and it disappeared because it didn't adapt. And I think companies and professionals have to adapt quickly to catch up with this. Otherwise, they're going to be in trouble. I mean, the target Shirley was mentioning of net zero by 2030, that is for projects that are being thought about right now. So if you're designing a project today, you need to be thinking about getting your project towards net zero, because if it's a big project or a referable scale project, the probability is that some of those phases will be being built towards the end of that period, and they will need to be net zero in all terms: construction, use, and so on, and maintenance, the whole lot.
And Simon, so businesses and organisations clearly need to adapt. We've got a question here, well, a sort of statement and a question saying the only way to really make this happen is to legislate it. To what extent do you think we need more legislation to really force organisations who aren't adapting quick enough to make the change?
Yeah, I think we certainly need legislation, and I think we need obviously thought through legislation. I think the London plan bit, I'm hoping that will prove to be very good and adoptable by others. I think, though, we also need national legislation. We need legislation from the government, who are getting their head around it. But I think also the government needs to lead by example. So, I've been having conversations with various government departments who are, in fairness, trying to find out, but actually, astonishing, they know very little about how to achieve zero carbon in certainly in the construction world, which is my world. So a lot needs to be done, and there's a lot that can be done quite quickly if, as we said, there's legislation and indeed leading by example. So all the spending ministries that build buildings, whether it's hospitals or whatever it is they build, and actually, to fairness, the NHS is starting to get their head around this, so that is quite good. But all the other ministries need to get involved. This MHC, it's not called something else, but HLCG, I think it is, are starting to get close to this, but they need to accelerate bays and so on. So all of these ministries need to get on the program, I think is the term.
And to what extent do we think that COP happening in November is going to help accelerate these plans, do you think, Simon?
Well, I think what it's doing is it's encouraging the Prime Minister to make statements which hopefully will be carried through. And it also means it's a form of accelerator, because I think everybody's now got a deadline for COP, a sort of mental deadline that things have to happen. Quite a few people are not necessarily sure what, but at least it's an accelerator. So I'm finding a lot of acceleration amongst all sorts of areas where people are saying, well, we really need to find out about this. It's all, COP's coming and so on. So amongst, for example, the Construction Industry Council's professional institutions, there's a lot of warm up and interest in there. Action plans have been produced and so on. So things are evolving and developing. I just hope the carry through is after COP as well, because that's where we really will need to start delivering. The ideas can come now, but we need to deliver, for the next several decades or forever.
Thank you, Simon. Shirley, we have a question here around reporting and performance information becoming more detailed performance information becoming a requirement for planning applications. Mm-hmm. We know there's lots of challenges around data and measurement and figuring out how well we are actually doing and how well designs are going to respond to targets and parameters that have been set. Is this something that you see evolving in the short term?
Yeah, I think it's part of the London Plan reporting requirements now. I think we did a lot of work when we set the policy in the draft London Plan. We went through the EIP, the consultations. Lots of people commented on it, but I think you cannot. This is a Bloomberg phrase, and probably he ripped off somebody else, but you cannot act without sort of understanding where your problem is. It's a very famous mantra about you cannot manage what you don't measure, and you have to report it as well, because it also helps accountability. I really do think it's important that people understand that you cannot act on anything really without data, and it's here to stay. And I think to your previous question about legislation and so on, one of the things about setting targets and reporting against them is that it does drive some action. Obviously, we have to be careful about overburdening all of us. We have requirements to report, for various networks that we're on as a city, and sometimes the stress is sort of filling that out. But it is helpful to understand where you need to act, where you need to target your funding, to act as a comparator to other organisations, other cities, to say, well, if they could do it, why can't we? Poses gets us posing questions. So I'm afraid for those who don't particularly want it, it's here to stay. And for those, who are doing it, I think just embrace it. It is good for you. It's good for understanding where you need to take action.
Thank you, Shirley. Another question, I think this one could be for you as well. Someone thanking Andrew for highlighting the electric power issue, but where is all the extra power generation going to come from?
Well, between us all, I think we can probably answer this one. I think, the key part of certainly the London Plan hierarchy, energy hierarchy, is about reducing our energy use, which is why energy efficiency is absolutely critical. We have to make our energy buildings more energy efficient. We need to think about how we use energy just more generally and more carefully. There is a combination of renewables. We have the grid. We will import still energy from outside a country, but how do we reduce the reliance on that? We're looking at storage, battery storage, in terms of sort of generating electricity and then storing it. So there are lots of different ways. If you look at the IEA, the International Energy Agency, they themselves are saying that we need to be reducing our reliance on fossil fuels, on oil, coal, and so on. So that really is saying we should be looking at renewables more.
I'd agree with all of Shirley's points, although perhaps controversially, I'd add to that list that we've got to look at base load, and the reality that may mean that our current nuclear fleet of reactors that we seem to be struggling to replace at scale, we may need to find different ways to replace the nuclear infrastructure. I think there's growing talk of sort of smaller nuclear reactors. I think potentially coming from UK manufacturers, or indeed from overseas, having to be part of the mix. And I think the recent sort of gas crisis perhaps brings that need into focus all the more, because that our nuclear reactors, several are sort of going offline at the end of this decade, and we could be left with quite a hole in our energy supply if we're not pragmatic about the mix that's needed moving forward.
Thank you, Andrew. So there's lots of challenges that have been emerging, both from questions coming through from the audience and that each of you have highlighted through the discussion. But I'd be interested to come to each of you in turn to just highlight what you think, what are the sort of top of your list challenges that you think we need to be facing head on as we lead into these discussions in November. Simon, could I start with you?
I hoped you weren't going to start with me, but I think it comes back to a lot of it to do sort of education and information. I think, there's a lot of the information is out there, a lot of it, as I've kind of alluded to. There's a lot that already can be done, but I think people need to be educated and upskilled in all senses to enable these things to happen. I think, that there is, as I said, sort of regulatory infrastructure in place already available. And we just need to take action. I think that certainly in London there is a London plan, and if people become more familiar with those sorts of things, then they can enable things to happen. So I think that would be my sort of key thing: is better information, or rather, information needs to be spread better, and people needed to engage with the detail of it, and both at a policy level and at a practical level.
So there's some personal responsibility there for us all to go out and engage with these resources. But where does the responsibility lie? Public sector, private sector? How can we drive this upskilling forward?
I think you're right. I mean, there is requirement for legislation at the highest level. There's also local legislation, and there's awareness. I think people need to be made more aware, and the information needs to be more immediately available. So if you are embarking on a project to build some housing for a local authority, the information you need to engage with a low carbon or net zero carbon project, you need to know where to find it. And it is there. I've already identified various bits of guidance that you can get your hands on. So it does, there is information out there. It can be done, but it does require, people to make a decision to do that. I know it's difficult. I've been working on projects where, when the delivery dates become very pertinent and urgent, all the good intentions tend to go out of the window, and they've got to come back in again, if you like, and people have got to engage with them. I mean, I believe it can all be done, and it's not too ambitious. But I do think we have to, help each other as well as have legislation.
Thank you, Simon. Working together to upskill, a big one for you, Andrew.
Well, I think it's incumbent on us all to keep asking difficult questions of ourselves, of our organisations, of partner organisations that we collaborate with, and it's it's at a sort of micro and a macro level. I mean, at the micro level at West London Business, we deliver lots of events that, frankly, sometimes probably had a bit too much red meat on the menu. Do we just need to say we're going to take all the meat out of of our food service at events? Might not be popular with everyone, but these are the some of the adjustments that we've got to start making at a more macro level. We, like I'm sure many on the call today, actively engaged in a variety of education institutions. We've got to not just make sure that there's a commitment to greening the curriculum, but we then got to open up the bonnet and go and observe lessons and look at lesson plans and the content of the curriculum, and make sure that's actually happening in practice rather than being simply talked about. So I think all day, every day, we've got to keep plugging away.
Thanks, Andrew. Shirley, biggest challenge for you?
Well, I've touched on before, the sort of powers and finance, but I think probably the biggest challenge is translating the sort of commitments that we're seeing people want to take, businesses, organisations across London, into tangible action that then inspires and raises awareness of Londoners and beyond, really, that things can change. And I think we've seen that through the pandemic, that how fast things can change and people can come together. There is a slow, and I've seen one of the questions is about the sort of slow drifting back to normality. But actually, if you look at the sort of polling that's out there, people don't want to return to that. And so what we've got to do is make it easier. The choice is easier for them to make greener choices, to use public transport, to live in sort of more energy efficient buildings and so on. And so that collaboration that Simon and Andrew have been talking about, we have a mechanism now through the London Recovery Board and the sort of 9 missions that we've agreed on, from improving our high streets to providing a safety net for people as furlough ends and universal credit uplift ends and so on. And we've got energy prices and so on. But the one mission I'm leading on with Mayor Glanville of Hackney is Green New Deal. And I talked about some of that funding is going into supporting SMEs through the Better Futures programme, but some of it is about, how do we work together on retrofit, on infrastructure, on skills and on jobs. And one programme that the Mayor is funding, which we'll be announcing the winners of at COP, or in that sort of COP week, is the Future Neighbourhoods 2030, which is really just trying to encourage applicants in London, and it's not just boroughs. We wanted communities or bids, housing associations, others, but working with the local authorities to come up with some ideas of how they're going to improve a particular locality within their borough to really show what a neighbourhood of 2030 would look like, from zero pollution, zero waste, zero carbon, more public transport. How do we maybe not shoot our packages in gas pipes, but how do we deliver packages in cargo bikes and that sort of thing, but really community designed and community owned, so it's not being done to the community, really to inspire the sort of action and raise awareness of what's possible. And I think, so watch out for those, because we've got some really interesting ideas. We're just going through the sort of shortlisting process at the moment, but that is about that sort of collaboration that's really difficult to pull off. And I think there is a will there, so it's really how do we help people to do that.
Thank you, Shirley. We've got a few minutes before we wrap up, so I'd just like to come to each of you with our closing question. And we've covered a lot of ground, but this just brings things back to COP and this moment that is happening in November. So I'd like to ask each of you what you think is the most important thing for London that should come out of the COP conference in November, and maybe just a thought on once that happens, how can we then implement it? What's the next check-in? How do we continue this momentum that we have that Shirley was just talking about? Andrew?
Well, COP, of course, as I think Simon touched upon, sort of creates the bandwidth, doesn't it? And forces the bandwidth for everyone, local, national, international, to have this critical conversation. And what we've got to hope is that enough consensus around, bold moves and policy comes out of the 2 weeks deliberation and all the run up to the conference. From West London Business, we've got about a dozen of our members in a WLB delegation heading up to COP, and they'll be part of the inner blue zone discussions. And what I'm sort of tasking them with is to really make sure that the story of our better futures exemplar companies from London are heard by delegates from around the world, and that seeing what is being achieved by these absolutely extraordinary groundbreaking businesses from our capital gives everyone confidence to be bold and then get on with it.
Thank you, Andrew. Simon?
I think what I would like to see is that the requirement for doing carbon assessments for referable schemes only is expanded to all schemes that are practicable. So obviously, if you're doing an individual house, that may not be, but by and large, that it is all practical. There is also something I'm involved in, which is Part Z, which is a building regulation for carbon, which I'm very keen that is part of this, that becomes part. So we have the building regulations and planning both converging in the same direction and encouraging things. I think also retrofit, I think Shirley's mentioned retrofit extensively, and I absolutely support that. I think that also we need to be, from the point of view of developers, where there are already buildings on sites that are not beyond economic reuse, and they should be retrofitted rather than demolished and rebuilt. And of course, the problem tends to be that developers buy these sites assuming redevelopment, which means that they pay too much for them, which makes retrofit more difficult. But I think retrofit's got to be fundamental to the mix. We've got to do more retrofitting and less new construction. And we have to, for new construction, we have to broaden the requirement for carbon assessments.
Thank you, Simon. Yes, retrofits come up a few times throughout this session. Simon, if I could just come to you again, reflecting on that retrofit point, what do you think, what more do we need? What action needs to be taken to really help move forward the retrofitting across London?
Well, I think again, it's a skills issue. I think that's been mentioned. I think also we need to be a bit more sophisticated about it. I think, the assumption you just put in some insulation, there's insulation, there's insulation. Some of it's quite low carbon insulation, some of it's quite high carbon insulation. So we need to be discerning about what we do. But again, that comes down to information and skills. So I think, there is an awareness, but we need to do it. We also need to do it. I think this upskilling, again, coming back to professionals, they need to be upskilled, because just by insulating buildings, if you don't do it correctly, you can create problems with damp, behind insulation and so on. So you have to get these things right. And so, again, it comes back to skills, learning, information.
Thank you, Simon. Shirley, interested to hear the key thing that you'd like to see coming out of COP26, and perhaps any reflections on Andrew and Simon's hopes and ambitions, and whether or not it's something that you think we can expect to see post-November.
Well, I'd hope so. I think, Simon, I think, was talking about, or both Simon and Andrew were talking about, this should raise the level of ambition. And I think that's the biggest thing we need to see out of COP, both from our government, in terms of what we're going to do domestically, but also internationally. And I think the big thing I would like to see is a recognition that non-state actors, so cities, businesses, community NGOs, their role is absolutely critical in helping deliver those NDCs, the targets that the governments are setting, and committing to greater targets. As I've said, in London, we are a huge centre of consumption and producers of emissions, direct emissions. Without tackling those emissions in big city centres, urban centres, or at local authority level, even, the governments are not going to make their target. So a recognition of that, I think, would be helpful, and also recognising that, as you talk about the next check-in, that this is the start. We talked about the IPCC earlier, the decade of action. It doesn't stop at COP. It really is. Everybody's turning up with commitments, but then they need to follow on. Lots of people, and if you're not already a member of or signed up to Race to Zero, there are various sort of subsectors of Race to Zero for businesses, for cities, and so on. And that requires people to sort of set science-based targets and take actions. And the idea is that we check in a year's time to see that the people are taking action, because it's absolutely critical that we do take that action and reduce those emissions. So I think that's the biggest thing that I'd hope that comes out of COP.
Thank you, Shirley. And thank you to all of you for your time this morning. Lots of interesting insights shared there, and references to lots of great resources. So Andrew, Simon, Shirley, I'm sure the audience would appreciate it if White Label can share those resources after the event, so that we can all go and do that extra reading. Very inspiring. Thank you all. I'll hand over to Catherine now to say a few closing points.
Amy, and thank you to all of you. It has been a really inspiring conversation, and we will certainly firstly share this as a video, so anyone that wants to watch it back, but we'll also share the resources. And I think what's come out of this is that not just for London, but for everyone, we all have to do our bit. And what is our commitment going to be? And Shirley's reference to signing up to the decade of action, I think, is a really good point to take away. So thank you all hugely for your input. Now we have more things coming up. I'm just going to share you a slide that tells you what you can all join in on later today. So we are heading, that's actually Monday, we need Tuesday, there we go. So we are doing how can the 20-minute neighbourhood help achieve carbon neutral ambitions? And then we're talking about creative, cohesive gardening communities. And then we have a wellbeing break, which by the time we've all been on a Zoom for the morning, we will all definitely need. So thank you again to everybody. I hope that you can all join us on future sessions. But for now, thank you and goodbye.
Bye.